Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Ing-wen. On today's program, Italian voters have spoken a big no to constitutional reforms, prompting Prime Minister Matteo Renzi to step down. And U.S. President-elect Donald Trump's phone conversation with Taiwan's leader, a diplomatic misstep or a sign of policy change? We start today's show with the referendum in Italy. Italian voters decided in a referendum whether or not to amend the country's 1948 constitution. Local media showed no votes were at 59%. That votes in favor of the reforms were only 41%. Renzi said the turnout of about 67% exceeded all expectations. Supporters of the vote no took to the streets and piazzas in Rome and early Monday to celebrate their victory. With the big no in Italy's polls, the economic and political uncertainty sent markets into a tailspin. Italian Prime Minister Matteo Renzi has announced that he will resign. He made his decision as exit polls suggested a large defeat in the referendum on the cabinet-backed constitutional reforms.
Domani pomeriggio riunirò il Consiglio dei Ministri.
Tomorrow afternoon, I will call a cabinet meeting, and I will thank my colleagues for an extraordinary adventure. It has been a united, strong, and compact team. I will then go to the presidential palace, where I will tender my resignation to the president.
Many say Renzi's departure will likely plunge Italy into a new phase of political uncertainty and possible economic turmoil. The defeat is also believed to pave way for the fast development of populism in the country. Before our discussion, let's take a look at this.
Italian Prime Minister Matteo Renzi on Sunday asked for the power to change Italy. For him, the vote was a one-time opportunity to radically reform Italy's flawed institutions. Renzi has been campaigning that his reforms would streamline Parliament, speed up the cumbersome lawmaking process and bring political stability to Italy, which has seen 60 governments in the past 70 years. But an overwhelming majority of people who voted rejected his proposals.
I tried to convince several of my friends that were thinking to vote no, to vote yes, because I think that it's a way to change something. It's not the best reform, but it's a good start.
These reforms are not well done. Yes, we must have reforms, but it must be done well, intelligently.
All opposition parties had lined up against the reform, but the loudest voice in the no camp was this man, Beppe Grillo. A former comedian turned politician, Grillo leads the anti-establishment 5-Star movement, which hopes that this result will propel it to win the next election and re-evaluate Italy's relationship with Europe. Matteo Renzi, the young, energetic centre-left reformist who took office in 2014, staked his political career and the future of Italy on Sunday's referendum. And in the year that saw the British vote to leave the European Union and the Americans to elect Donald Trump, Italy became the latest domino to fall as anti-establishment voting gathers momentum around the world. Kate Parkinson, CCTV, Rome.
For more on the Italian referendum and its impact, join me in the Beijing studio, Ing-wen, director of the Institute of International Affairs at Renmin University. Meanwhile, joining us from Rome, we have Francesco Sisci, who is a psychologist and also author and columnist. In Brussels, Tania Marocci, who is a policy analyst at the European Policy Center. Welcome to the three of you. First of all, Ms. Sisci, coming from Rome, help us to understand what do you think this vote is for? Is it vote against Mr. Renzi's administration? Is it about the unsatisfaction of the realities of the economy? Or is it a big no to the European Union?
I think the main thing in Italy, the feeling at least, is that many people voted against Renzi. Was the main thing. Most people didn't really understand what the referendum was about, didn't understand what the European Union was about, but they were deeply dissatisfied with the Renzi administration. So it's very difficult to know will we go after that? Because, yes, no to Renzi, but then what?
Ms. Marocci, coming from the Brussels perspective, what is this for, this vote? For no? No against whom and what?
I must say I agree also with my colleague. I don't think that this was a vote against Europe. Europe was not really part of the discussion. It was very much a vote against the Prime Minister, Mr. Renzi. This was clear. It was, I would say, a mistake from his part at the beginning to tie the result of the referendum to his position, since he said at the beginning that he would resign if a no vote would have won, and many of the anti-systemic parties and the populist parties, such as the Lega Nord and the Five Star Movement, were very successful, clearly, in campaigning against the Prime Minister. Right. Posters, slogans from these parties were clearly against Renzi and not against the constitutional reform. So even in their message, when they
okay, Mr.
Yes?
Mr. Shishi, what do you think? How would you compare this vote about the constitutional change in your country, Italy, vis-a-vis the Brexit vote inside the UK? Is it the same logic or very different circumstances?
No, I think there is something similar and there are some differences. There is a wave of dissatisfaction of the middle class towards the establishment. The middle class have been living better lives ever since World War II. But for the past years, I would say since 2008, there has been a dramatic drop in their living standards. And there's been a great dissatisfaction with whatever the governments have been doing. So this is one element. The other element is that, unfortunately, in Italy, Renzi didn't understand the popular mood, didn't get the popular mood. Most people were actually in favor of these constitutional reforms, but were against him personally. If he had taken a step back and said, you know, vote for the reforms, I don't take part in the referendum, I'm not part of the deal, I'm willing to step down whenever you want, whatever, we would have now the reforms, but anyway, we would not have Renzi because people are not satisfied with Renzi and his government.
Professor Wang in Beijing, what do you think about the discussion we just had earlier with these two European guests coming from China? How do you observe the situation over there in Italy? What is it about, really?
Firstly, I think referenda is very dangerous. It's a political gamble, particularly for the young politicians like David Cameron and Renzi, who are difficult to manage this, make the consensus before have a referenda. So we should learn the lesson. Secondly, I think the world is very uncertainty. People predict that the only certainty is uncertainty. So people not worried about this referendum, but after that, if they have the referenda of the Italian exist, something like that. But this is not necessary, but people still can predict that will not happening.
Well, not Italy exit if there's another word like that, but certainly there's a Frexit because there's already word similar being invented in France. Before we go there to talk about what is exactly going on with the European Union and its future, let's focus still on Italy. Ms. Marocci, what do you think about the possibilities of a caretaking government from now on, or an early election? Do you see parties within Italy will be able to come to any consensus about these two possibilities? Briefly.
I think it's very difficult to make a forecast at the moment. We shall see what comes out from the meeting that Renzi will have with our President of the Republic, Mattarella, this afternoon. But I think that the best option and the most likely option is that we will have a technical government with somebody that is picked from the Democratic Party. Mr. Renzi in his speech gave a sense that he will be out, that in a way it will be to the forces that were, the political forces that were pushing for the no to take over from here. And I think it might be, but this is just speculation, that he's trying to gamble in a way and to see, because he presented himself in his speech as a sort of outsider. He said he is different from the political class, he stepped down, he takes responsibility, which is a message that I think resonates with Italian people, and that might give him some better chances if we were to go to early elections, because he could present himself as a viable alternative.
Well, Mr. Sicci, if I remember right, Prime Minister Renzi, before his resignation, already mentioned this is going to be the end of his political life. That's what he said in the exact quote. Is there still room for him to come back? Do you think, is he still going to be relevant in the Italian politics anymore?
Well, there could be some relevance, although it's very hard to see now what kind of relevance is there, will be there. I think there will be a caretaking government, because still there is no consensus about an electoral law, so we don't know how the Italians will vote. And so if we don't know how the Italians will vote, we don't know if and how Renzi will take part in the next elections, and we don't know what kind of role he will have. He's still very young, but what is very interesting is that a massive vote was against him, and many people who voted for the reforms despite him. His popularity in Italy is very, very low, and it will be very hard to climb up again.
Okay, I think at this moment the fate of Mr. Renzi and the fate of the next government is still honey in the air. But there are other things that are very important. With Professor Wang here in Beijing, that is, what does this say about the overall political environment inside the EU and also inside the Eurozone? Before you answer that question, sir, I want to point out a mix of information. This, of course, is a referendum against the change. Some say that is an indication of the upswing of the right in the European countries, including Italy. However, there's another result. Austria had its own election, and apparently it is not the far right that has got the favor. What do you think about this mixed signals coming now from the European continent? Immediate signals, of course, I'm talking about.
That means that we get not too pessimistic about the future. Even the
It
Brexit.
depends on what is pessimistic and what is optimistic you're talking about.
Even the Brexit, now the Supreme Court also say not necessary that we'll start the process next March. So maybe it's not finished the jobs. So
because the High Court inside the UK are also talking about a role for them to play.
Even the, I think regret for the referenda. Even in Italy, I think the Italy's constitution also limited the power for referenda to quit any international treaty, including the European Union. So not so much, pessimistic about after this referenda, maybe another referenda is coming, another Brexit. Not necessary.
Not necessary. Let me go to Mr. Sicci. What do you think?
Well, I think your point is very interesting, Austria. That I think it proves, and even the result in England, and in a way also the result in America with Trump, is that yes, there is a dissatisfaction of the middle class. But yes, if you address this dissatisfaction in the right way, as the Austrian did, well, you can still stem the tide. you can channel this dissatisfaction in the right way. There is hope. It's not a necessary bad. The problem is that several candidates, in a way, for the right side, Cameron, Renzi, and in a way Hillary Clinton, misunderstood the mood of the people. They thought they were on the winning side when they were in fact on the losing side of history. So the problem, the great challenge of the reasonable politicians in Europe is to how to get the mood of the people and tell the people, okay, yes, there are problems, but we can do better. We can unite the country, and there is hope. This is a big hope, and on the one hand, but also a big challenge because it's very difficult. It's uncharted territories for politicians in Europe, and we will see this in Italy in the next few days, but most importantly in France in next spring, where there is a very, very big challenge.
As we said earlier about France, Marine Le Pen, of course, her National Front party congratulated the result of the referendum in Italy. They consider it as a boost to their political stance. Ms. Marocci in France, so are some of the other countries far right. What do you think about this specific referendum result in relation to the rise of the far right in Europe? And will they be the dominating voice in the coming elections in many countries that we're likely to see?
Well, I think certainly the far right and...
Ms. Marocci.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Go ahead. Present your answer.
Okay, so I think that for sure the populist far-right forces are gaining ground in Europe. This is undeniable, and it's clear that, as my colleague said, we are witnessing a change in the mind of people. The middle class is losing ground, has been losing ground now for many years, and we need political forces in Europe that are able to interpret and provide answers to people's dissatisfactions with the system. I think that clearly the campaign that was run by Five Star Movement and Lega Nord, the Northern League in Italy, was very much on this, based on this simple populistic messages that are appealing, that clearly they gain traction. But this is also because people lack an alternative. The alternative that is provided is not constructive enough and is not appealing enough. And also I think it's much easier to be destructive than to be constructive.
Right,
so this is the force of the message of these forces in Europe.
To be constructive, I guess that there's one thing that the governments have to be constructive, that is what to do with the economies inside Europe. Italy, for example, the referendum result could have long-term implications, many believe. There has been growing concerns over financial stability in Europe's third largest economy. Take a look at this. Italy's economy is 12% smaller than when the financial crisis began in the year 2008. Banks remain weak, and the country's debt-to-GDP ratio at 133% is the second only to Greece. There is a risk that the failure of a major bank could set off a wider crisis. Repairing the banks could become very, very difficult, as we understand amid particularly political uncertainty. I want to address this question to you, Professor Wang. Even though it is Italy's economy, China is very concerned because China is buying into the European debts, and 1/3 of those European debts are actually from Italy. So when you look at these numbers, attitude do you think Beijing should have in terms of quite a crisis going on inside Rome?
That's the reason we always supported European integration. We also always supported the certainty, not the uncertainty. Definitely, China, European Union, they are highly economic mutual independent. So we need European Union stable and also member states stable. The banking crisis now is very worried about. So far, the euro jumped and quite stable, not as dangerous as
it went down
previously.
earlier, but then bounced back again.
Yeah, but the bank, whether the patch test is enough, not its domino effect to other banking. Even the United States also highly concerned about what happened in Italy.
Ms. Marocci, how much do you think consensus is there for the European Union to work on the banking issues, particularly in these failed banking countries such as Italy? Is there some remedies already besides talking about politics? Briefly.
I think it's very difficult to talk about these remedies without taking into account the political situation, because since the situation is so difficult and moods are swinging very fast, the political risk is it's something to take in high consideration when taking into account when considering economic measures.
Right. Does that mean, Mr.
And I think
Xixi,
that in Brussels there is.
Sorry, I cut you short. Go ahead once again, Ms. Marocci.
No, sorry, I just meant that in Brussels is aware that these considerations, political and economic, should go hand in hand in this situation.
Well, that does political, economic go hand in hand means no action, or let's just wait for whatever crisis is being unveiled over there, Mr. Xixi. The role of the EU countries, or Brussels, and also what Rome can do itself.
Well, I think at this point it is very important to see what Rome can do itself, because the number you mentioned is very important, because in percentage, yes, the Italian debt is second to Greece, but in total numbers, as total assets, the Italian debt is the biggest, the single biggest in Europe, is the massive. So nobody can save Italy. This is important. Unless Italy gets the courage, gets the stamina itself to push forward, Italy will be in a lot of trouble and could carry a lot of trouble for the rest of Europe. This is the main concern of both the Italian politicians and the European politicians. So this afternoon, the following days, the following hours are extremely important to see what political solution can come out of Rome.
All right. Thank you so much for the three of you at this very critical juncture, I have to say, ladies and gentlemen, to talk to us about your insights, what's going on in Italy, and what it would mean for the European Union as a whole. Wang Ing-wen, Francesco Xixi, Tania Marocci, thank you so much. Really appreciate it, the three of you. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian-Wei, still to come on our program. One phone call that's seen as totally out of line. We will weigh in on Mr. Trump's direct contact with Taiwan's leader. You're watching World Insight Monday to Friday every day on CCTV News. In an unprecedented break with the accepted China-U.S. protocol, U.S. President-elect Donald Trump has spoken with the leader of Taiwan region by phone. Beijing was quick to lodge a formal complaint with Washington over the call. Let's take a look.
For the first time in nearly 4 decades, believed to be the first since 1979, an incoming U.S. leader, President-elect Donald Trump, spoke with the leader of Taiwan over the phone. Trump tweeted that he was called by Ing-wen. Beijing was swift to respond, lodging a stern complaint with Washington. Foreign Minister Wang Yi reiterated China's diplomatic protest on Saturday.
Adherence to the One China principle is the cornerstone of the healthy development for China-U.S. ties and an important political basis. We certainly hope this political basis is not interfered with in any way.
The Obama administration apparently had no warning that the phone conversation between Trump and Taiwan's leader was going to take place, later reassuring Beijing that the call does not mean a change in U.S. diplomatic policy. Quote, "We remain firmly committed to our One China policy based on the 3 joint communiques and the Taiwan Relations Act." China also showed confidence in its bilateral relations with the U.S., which would not change over what it calls petty action.
The Taiwan side's engagement and a petty action cannot change the one China structure by the international community. I believe that it won't change the long-standing one China policy of the United States government.
The U.S. has no diplomatic relations with the island of Taiwan and has maintained its support for the One China policy for more than 40 years. Last week, President Xi had met with the architect of diplomatic relations between Beijing and Washington, former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. She had made one of the first congratulatory calls to Trump and told Kissinger Beijing and Washington are at a new starting point.
For more on the phone call between U.S. President-elect Donald Trump and Taiwan leader Tsai Ing-wen, we are now joined in our Beijing studio Ye Hailin, Director of the Center for South Asian Studies at the National Institute of International Strategy, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. In Taipei, we are joined by Ms. Joanna Lei, a former legislator who is now the Chief Executive Officer of the Changhua 21st Century think tank. She is originally with the Kuomintang Party, and we are hoping to be joined by an American guest in no time. But for now, let me ask you first, Ms. Lei, what do you make of the motivation behind Ms. Tsai's phone call with Mr. Donald Trump, the president-elect?
Well, certainly this is a very opportunistic call for Ms. Tsai Ing-wen because one of the U.S. envoy was visiting Taiwan and facilitated this call, and it's reported to be Mr. Yates. Mr. Tsai Ing-wen is certainly heavily boosted by this call in terms of Ms. Tsai Ing-wen, both in terms of her popularity locally, approval rating, as well as the agenda she's pursuing. So there's no denial that this is a great call for Tsai Ing-wen. However, it is very puzzling for a lot of people to see why Donald Trump not only accepted the call, but also tweeted in two separate times, and those tweets are still in the Facebook today. You can easily check those Facebook postings.
Yes, indeed. President Obama earlier said that how one campaign would not necessarily mean how he's governed. But take a look at what happened today. Donald Trump has lashed out at China again on his personal Twitter account, accusing Beijing of manipulating its currency, which is not true, an accusation, unfairly taxing U.S. products and militarizing the South China Sea. All of these are not admitted by China at all. But so, Mr. Ye, once and again, from Beijing's perspective, or at least as a scholar like you, what do you think the president-elect, Mr. Trump, is trying to achieve?
In my understanding, firstly, this phone call between Donald Trump and the Tsai Ing-wen, I think it's a pragmatic issue, and it's mainly because of some lobbyist activity in D.C. But on the other hand, we noticed that Donald Trump also obviously would like to see some consequence. So talking about his motivation, in my personal opinion, it doesn't matter because he definitely didn't want to take this back. They want to see what will happen. So this kind of the trick for Donald Trump. Before he's taking the power, he want to send release signals to wait and see what's the potential response from China. If China want to argue with them, we'll provide more weapons for Donald Trump to launch the diplomatic action against China when he takes the power. But if China remains silent, we'll lay the foundation, new foundation for Donald Trump to formulate his policy towards China. That means, okay, such kind of things you can take it, and this will be the new base.
Right. So that is the dilemma, of course, Beijing is facing right now. But what about for Taipei, particularly for the Kuomintang Party? We understand that Ms. Tsai from the ruling party now, her action would won her approval rating high, maybe for now, but not necessarily for the stability and peace of Taiwan for near future and much more for the long term. Ms. Lei, given this background, President-elect, Ms. Tsai just in power, and all in transition, how do you think the Kuomintang should react to this and see the realities on the island?
Well, certainly this is a very difficult time for KMT. KMT has advocated a peace and development approach with mainland China, arguing that that is the best way to secure stability and peace for the region. However, Tsai Ing-wen has not formally recognized the 92 consensus and throwing the cross-strait relations to a tailspin. So it is very clear that Tsai Ing-wen is trying to take a departure from Ma Ying-jeou's approach as well as Lian Zhan's approach. And at the same time, you have a president-elect from the United States who is also taking a departure from his predecessors, not only Obama, but probably all the way to 1979. And this new player in the United States will throw a lot of envelope pushing to the cross-strait relations as well as to the East China Sea and South China Sea issues. So we are certainly in uncharted waters in this triangular relationship between US, Taiwan, and China. You are now having two major players who have very different agendas from their predecessors, and now we are sailing into uncharted water, like you said, unprecedented.
That's indeed true. Mr. Ye, the question is, how does China see the role of Mr. Trump at this moment? He is the president-elect. He's not the president yet. Yeah. Even though Chinese President Xi Jinping spoke to him on the phone, but that was speaking to him on behalf of China for congratulating him winning the office, which he is not in at the moment. Well, at the same time, China has been hearing from Washington, the current administration, that it is still sticking to its policy of one China policy, handing down, as Ms. Lei said, from 1979. So, who should Beijing listen to? The White House? Or the guy who is going to be in the White House?
Actually, it won't be any difference for China. Because just you mentioned, China has a dilemma, but in my understanding, this is the real Chinese dilemma. Because Donald Trump is not the president yet. He is the Mr. Trump, is not the President Trump. So China won't take any serious action against such kind of behavior to the United States government because he is not speak on behalf of the United States government. But when he's take the power, China will see whether there is some shift.
Right.
While he was the president elected, all the president on duty. So this still have some time window. But for China, the question is, if China just remains silent, Donald Trump will say, okay, China is a country they can bully. So for China, had to make a certain level response, but unfortunately, this response may not targeting on the United States, but probably will targeting on Taiwan Island.
I will see. We see what might be happening. Mr. Douglas Paul is joining us on the phone. Mr. Paul, of course, is the Vice President of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, very experienced diplomat from the U.S., been working in Taiwan for years. Mr. Paul, many would ask, people like you in Washington, how have you been responding to Mr. Trump's rhetorics and the phone calls with Ms. Tsai Ing-wen?
Well, the response is that we don't know quite how to interpret the deeper meaning of these gestures toward Taiwan and some of the comments that have been made now on his tweet account. I would expect that we're going to see him doing in the international sphere what he did in domestic politics, which is to rewrite all the rules and attempt to do things in his own style. And until we see him in office, I think that your guest's caution not to overreact would be very wise. In office, if he tries to bring this style, we're all going to have to make adjustments, and he probably will have to make adjustments in return as president. But before he becomes president, we are still seeing him doing the kind of rebellious and rule-changing behavior that helped him get elected president.
That's a great point. Having said that, though, Mr. Paul, we have known already about Mr. Trump, the president-elect, what kind of people have been around him for him to pick as advisors or key members of his cabinet, of his administration, including some who have some very close relationship with the ruling party now in Taiwan. What do you think these people's impact might be on Mr. Trump, who is not necessarily the most experienced among them all when it comes to international relations or foreign policy?
Well, I think they have some influence, but I think if you look at the long list of names being considered for Secretary of State, it's very hard to pin down one ideology or one partisan or political leaning over another. It's a very heterodox and unusual list of candidates. And until he decides who's going to be his spokesperson, we could go in quite different directions. There's always been a strand in the Republican Party that says you should be more vocal in support of the democracy on Taiwan and be more resistant to PRC pressures with respect to Taiwan. How far to take that is always the question that the executive has to answer when he has full responsibility for the relationship. And of course, we've got a new executive with a business background who has a tendency to load up his first bargaining position in an effort to strengthen that position for later trades in reaching a final deal. How much of that has come in with Mr. Trump? Probably a lot, judging from his behavior so far.
All right.
So I think it really would be smart for Beijing to stay cool, not to overreact, to take time, try to assess things. You're a big country. The U.S. is a big country. There's no point in jumping at each other when we have plenty of time to make a cool assessment of what the real implications are.
Mr. Paul, the question is how prepared and how much prepared people should be, whether it's Beijing or other capitals around the world. That is also my final question for you, because you have seen this one China policy between Beijing and Washington has been the focus of attention for the two countries for 4 decades. It is not an easily fought out bottom line between these two countries. So if pushing envelopes happening on this front and very fiercely coming from the future administration, what would this mean, the final stake here between Beijing and Washington? Can Washington politics be able to be responsible for what's likely to happen if that were the case?
Well, Ms. Tian, as you know very well, with successive changes of government in the United States, we have had periods where the adjustment of the new administration to the abiding realities takes a bit of time. But in every case since the opening of our relationship, every administration, Democrat and Republican, has returned to basics and to fundamentals. One China, I think, is probably that kind of basic policy approach. I don't anticipate there'll be a change. If you listen to Mr. Trump's most authoritative spokespeople, who appeared on American talk shows on Sunday, as they do, they were trying to say that they want to have I interpret them as trying to say they want the benefit of trying something new and acknowledging Taiwan's importance to its constituencies, etc. But at the same time, they don't want to run a big downside risk. So they both Pence and Conway, two spokespeople, said that they're not trying to change the one China formula. Again, I would advise a patience and a calm attitude befitting a big power watching this transition in the U.S.
Listening to the words, watching the real actions, that's always been a belief by China. We'll see what's going to happen. Thank you so much, Dr. Paul, for being with us. Really appreciate it. Let's come back to our discussion between Joanna Lei and Ye Hailian. Ms. Lei, may I ask you, in the coming year, there is going to be another round of arms sales to Taiwan from the United States. Every time China PRC protested against it, but every time with the strong political backing Washington, it could happen. It could happen this time as well. So there's likely to be a series of events which is likely to be the tester about what Washington really means. How do you see the meanings possibly to come out of these already frequent events and barometers?
Well, certainly every time when DPP is in a ruling party position, both Chen Shui-bian and Tsai Ing-wen have formally proposed to increase the arms buildup in Taiwan for defense purposes. So Mr. Donald Trump, the president-elect, also mentioned that U.S. sells billions of dollars of arms to Taiwan and why he shouldn't answer a call. So there is a precursor. I think they're setting the stage for greater arms sales to Taiwan in the years to come. And this is also one of the 5 economic pillars announced by Ms. Tsai Ing-wen. The defense industry was one of her 5 pillars. Every time we buy something from the United States, there will be an industrial offset that will be fulfilled locally and help build up the local defense industry. So I do expect a greater arms sales between the United States and Taiwan, but however, this time they may meet the resistance from mainland China. There might be a different kind of discussion as we have seen in the past 8 years in Ma Ying-jeou's reign.
Right. Mr. Ye, now, until Mr. Trump comes into the office, after Mr. Trump comes into the office, likely to come up with his plan, international relations, and then arms sales to Taiwan, how will China prepare for each of these possible stops?
Very, very simple answer from me. Actually, we should understand one essential point. For China to against the Taiwan arms sale, it's because of its our political stance. It's not our national security concern. That means for the aspect of military, arms sales doesn't mean anything. So for China, I think we don't really worry about this arms sale. We against it because of this for the legitimate, we have the right to against, but we don't worry. So that means if Tsai Ing-wen want to buy more weapons, okay, be my guest. After all, we won't pay the money. She will pay. And see, if you want to pay something, you need to these things. It's valuable for your purpose, but how much this weapon could be valuable for the so-called Taiwan self-defense?
That will be the question I want to put to Ms. Lei before we go. Very briefly, Ms. Lei. Taiwan is being used now as a card, many believe, by Mr. Trump, the president-elect, for his future pushing envelopes on whatever he wants to achieve. How much will this card be still relevant to him? And how much price will Taiwan pay for being a card? That is the ultimate question, isn't it? The people in Taiwan have to consider.
Well, last time in Chen Shui-bian's first term, he proposed over 600 billion NT dollars arms purchase procurement from the United States, and we do expect Tsai Ing-wen to propose something in the similar scale. I think it is clear that Donald Trump is playing with the element of surprise. He's trying to set up and establish a first mover advantage, but he is also a very shrewd business person. We hope that he will come back to another element of compromise and at the end of the day to rebuild his relationship with PRC. The more stable the U.S.-PRC relationship is, probably the better it will be for Taiwan as well.
All right, Joanna Lei, Ye Hailin, thank you so much for being with us. I understand it is the personal opinions you have expressed, but certainly those are insights we will take into consideration. Thank you for being with us. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of a program, visit our website. Just type World Insight CCTV News into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian-Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching and tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.